Indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants of Canada, everybody knows. They have lived on this land for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived. So, who exactly are the Indigenous peoples in Canada?
The government changed the title of Indigenous people over time, originally calling us Indians.
Residential schools, as per my research, which was operated from 1831 to 1996 and removed over 150,000 Indigenous children from their families, exposing many to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse.
So the impacts, we're still seeing them today. A lot of the Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, weren't even aware that residential schools existed.
What are the common myths and misconceptions about Indigenous people?
I will say one is that Indigenous people don't pay taxes. Well, that's completely not true.
Indigenous people are unable to adapt to mainstream life.
I'm here. So that's a misconception, right?
All right, good evening and welcome to another brand new edition of Beyond the Borders Season 1. With me, Arjun. You are listening to CKLU 96.7 on 96.7, CKLU.ca and Radio Player Canada. Thank you so much for listening. And you know what? Starting from tomorrow, March 3 till March 9, it's a CKLU Plays Week. Plays Week is our annual fundraiser, and every dollar you contribute help us continue providing unique content, amplifying local voices, and supporting community initiatives. So to donate, visit cklu.ca. All donations can be made at cklu.ca, and also keep tuning to CKLU 96.7 FM. Our station needs you. Well, talking about today's guest, today we are honored to introduce none other than Andrea Dokis, a proud daughter of the Dokis First Nation, whose life is deeply rooted in Indigenous traditions. Growing up immersed in her community's rich cultural heritage, Andrea has dedicated herself to uplifting First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Now, residing in Sudbury, she balances her role as a devoted partner and mother of two with her inspiring work as the director of Wabnode, Indigenous Student Success and Services at Cambrian College, following impactful roles at Shkagamik-Kwe Health Centres. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us as we dive deep into the rich history, vibrant culture, and significant contributions of Indigenous communities, while also addressing current challenges and debunking the misconceptions and myths that continue to shape perceptions of Indigenous peoples, right here on Beyond the Borders on CKLU 96.7. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my guest for tonight, and she is none other than Andrea Dokis. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, and I'm really privileged to have you on the show. And I always wanted to talk about Indigenous people and their, contributions and the beauty of Indigenous people as well. So without any further ado, let's jump into the very first questions. How did growing up in Dokis First Nations and being involved in traditional cultural activities shape your identity and passion for Indigenous community work?
Well, I'd like to say I was born and raised there. Unfortunately, I was born in a hospital, and so when my parents brought me back home, that's where I, began my journey living in Dokis. And so I'm very fortunate to grow up. Dokis is located about an hour and 45 minutes south of Sudbury in the middle of French River, and very small, semi-isolated First Nation. And I would like to say that I'm probably one of the fortunate ones. My sister and I had parents who were actively involved in our community. It's probably where my passion started from. Watching my mom and dad just be fully involved. And my dad was chief at one time of our First Nation, you know, and then he passed on, and then my mom has always been involved. She was actually a part of our community health initiatives, and so the saying that says a village or a community, it takes a community to raise a child. That definitely happened in Dokis, and so if my mom wasn't so actively involved, or my father wasn't so actively involved in community and encompassing the values and of the culture and the teachings, I don't think I'd be where I'm at today. Definitely, they've instilled that love and passion for working with and for community.
So, what inspired you to pursue your career and support Indigenous peoples, and how have your nearly decade of experience, as director of community programs at Shkagamik, health centers, and experience as an Aboriginal patient navigator, shape your leadership at currently involved institutions?
So I fortunate enough to, like I said, just to run off from the previous question, I was born and raised in Dokis. I moved away for school. I had the opportunity to come to Cambrian College. That's where I started my post-secondary, and continued on into Laurentian. And so right after that, I was immediately hired at Shkagamik-Kwe Health Centre as a health educator, health promoter. I did that for about 7.5 years, where it actually didn't feel like a job. It was exciting. It was fun. I think it was very important for Indigenous people to give back to community.
Sure.
With some of the complications or health issues that our Indigenous people face on a day-to-day basis. And then I was given the opportunity to become the Aboriginal patient navigator, and that was a collaboration between Shkagamik-Kwe and Health Sciences North, where you're working with Indigenous patients who are from the community, but also coming from other communities who are accessing Health Sciences North for some services. So being an advocate, accompanying them to their medical appointments, being the extra set of ears or that extra voice to ensure that there was cultural safety occurring. And so I think with that, in the few years that I did that role, it allowed me to become the director of community programming. And that kind of just fell into my lap, so to speak. Our director at the time for community programming was leaving the community, but still kind of working with Shkagamik-Kwe, and it allowed me the opportunity to grow and develop into some of those leadership skills that has helped me become a director of Wabnode at Indigenous Student Services at Cambrian today.
So, being the Wabnode Indigenous Student Success and Services, data from Canadian educational reports reveal that Indigenous students face graduation rates up to 50% lower than their non-Indigenous peers. So, what unique challenges do Indigenous students face in higher education today, and how is Cambrian College working to support their success and preserve their cultural heritage? As a director, what do you want to say?
Well, I think there's a multitude of of challenges that face our students. Intergenerational trauma from residential schools, 60 scoop. I can go on and name more. But I also think that if we have students who are coming from remote communities or northern communities, they are leaving their community, their home, their familiarity to come and pursue post-secondary education. And that in itself is, they have to put on this brave face. They have to come out. Some of them are accepting coming to the school and don't even have housing. And housing is such a big issue, right? So that's one of the challenges. And so, retention is definitely something new in my role, that I've completely left healthcare into education. And so I'm learning all of these terminologies in the education system where, student retention, academic outcomes, and graduation rates, right? And so we need to acknowledge that, Indigenous people live in a continuous cycle of interconnectedness, and it's not linear or disconnected. in the scale. And so it's a lifelong learning process that we need to remember. It starts from birth. And it continues through generations, correct? So we have to ensure most of the post-secondary institutions, specifically colleges that I'm aware of, and I would assume universities, the Indigenous education protocol has to be followed throughout the college academic programming and governance. All staff and faculty, in making change for the TRC calls to action. And so I think the challenges that the students face, and we are starting to implement, specific things, especially here. I think we're lucky at Cambrian College that we have Wabnode. And I do believe Laurentian has their own Indigenous services as well. I think that it's important that it's a home away from home. That's the atmosphere that we are trying to create at Wabnode.
You were talking about Wabnode Center for Indigenous Student Success and Service. What is this, and what key services does the center offer that make it an essential resource for Indigenous students in Sudbury? And also, can you share about the center's missions and vision at the same time?
So Wabnode, it's an Indigenous name for the center. And it means new beginning or new journey. And so we want our students to remember and acknowledge that they're on this new journey coming into post-secondary education. And we are fortunate at Cambrian, our Cambrian Indigenous Student Circle, which is the student government for Indigenous Student Services, is in the same area as our Indigenous Student Success and Services. And so we work together and collaborate on many functions or activities to allow the students to come and feel comfortable with respect as well. And that's reciprocal, right? We respect the students respect us. And they're leaving their communities where they're just not living with their mom and dad. They're living with their grandparents, or their grandparents are heavily involved in their lives. They have aunties and uncles. And having the term auntie and uncle in our community are very important titles. And so, my hope or my vision would be to create not just a home away from home, but also have those roles kind of represented within Wabnode, feeling comfortable to come and see any of the staff. And, if they feel comfortable enough to call us an auntie or call us an uncle, or, and so I think it's important that we have cultural appropriate programming where we have elders and cultural safe practices occurring. But we open it up for the students to actively engage as well. And so I think it's important because that's going to help them with their success.
So, Indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants of Canada, everybody knows. They have lived on this land for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived. So, who exactly are the Indigenous peoples in Canada?
Well, we're quite a diverse population, right? And so the government has changed the title of Indigenous people over time, originally calling us Indians, and then changing the terminology to Aboriginal, and then now Indigenous. And Indigenous is a global term,
Right.
but in Canada, there's 3 populations that identify under the definition of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And so that's First Nations people, the Métis, and the Inuit. And so it's important to remember, too, in Canada, there's 634 recognized bands and 3,100 reserves, but that's subjected to the Indian Act, right? And so we just got to remember that we treat everybody with distinction, that everybody is the same.
There are 3 groups of Indigenous community. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit.
Correct.
All right, beautiful. Let's talk about the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Indigenous peoples have lived in here for thousands of years, developing rich and diverse cultures long before European contact. Could you please provide a brief overview of the key historical milestones of Indigenous people here in Canada?
Wow, that's a loaded question. And very complex, I will say.
Right.
The history of Indigenous people in Canada is complex, and you're, like, as you mentioned, the original people of Canada. And so originally, Indigenous people were allies to the European descendants. We helped them, so to speak, fight off anybody who was trying to get into Canada. And so we helped them with that. And then, came the Royals with their Royal Proclamation, and then the Indian Act, then treaties, right? And so along with all of these legal terms, or whatever you want to, constitutional terms, governmental terms, there came a point where we weren't allies anymore. And this probably happened before the Royal Proclamation. But I will state that, the biggest, how can I say that? The biggest part of what the Europeans, the descendants, wanted to do was decimate the Indian, eliminate the Indian, right? And so there was assimilation tactics that were done. And so part of those assimilation tactics were the formation of residential schools, later on the 60s scoop, coerced sterilization of men and women, right? And so these are the realities that some people aren't even aware of that happen in Canada's history, right? And then that's not even limiting the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited plus, right? And so in our child welfare system, our Indigenous people being, huge numbers in prisons, right? In the justice system. And so that all is a part of the history. And it's also current issues. They haven't gone away, right? And so those are the pieces I think we have to remember, that's the history.
Right. Now, coming to residential schools, residential schools, as per my knowledge, as per my research, which was operated from 1831 to 1996 and removed over 150,000 Indigenous children from their families, exposing many to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, while erasing their cultural identities, have left deep scars till now, as you mentioned, intergenerational trauma. Given this devastating history, what were the impact of a residential school till the date? How are, Indigenous community addressing this, intergenerational trauma and stemming from historical injustice like residential schools? It's a complex topic, sensitive topic.
Yeah.
What do you want to say about this?
So the impacts, we're still seeing them today, right? You have to remember, and maybe people don't know, a lot of the Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, weren't even aware that residential schools existed, right? And so I think that's where, this education or awareness or, comprehension of some kind needs to happen. And, our Indigenous people were forcibly taken. These children were taken from their homes, their communities. The only thing they knew was their family, their language, their culture, their ceremonies, right? And so they were taken, and if they were taken with siblings, they were separated once they got to the residential schools. And you got to remember, these residential schools were purposely placed hundreds of miles away from their home communities, and then often transferred as well once they got there, right? And so you have to remember that they endured cutting of their hair. The priests and the nuns were forcibly scrubbing their skins to take, quote unquote, the brown off their skin, right? And the cruelty that they went through, these children, stripped of the clothes that they showed up in, forced to wear uniforms, right? Not allowed to speak their language anymore, and not allowed to do ceremony, right? And so when you're stripped of that, that causes trauma,
True.
right? And a lot of these children were given English names and or a number. So they were identified as Johnny or 125 or 12502, right? And so you have to remember, like, what does that do to somebody's identity? It causes trauma. So the intergenerational trauma, the definition of it, right, is generation to generation.
True.
Due to, relocation, dispossession of land, loss of culture and identity, a language, spiritual practices, right? And so the intergenerational trauma is passed down from generation to generation. And we're seeing the effects happen and occur today. And so I don't know what else you had at the end of your question in terms of intergenerational trauma, but, some of these stereotypes and myths and misconceptions that are throughout society come from government and come from those residential schools where priests and nuns and service workers, created these stereotypes and misconceptions of our people.
So you just talk about misconceptions, despite ongoing efforts to counter stereotypes, and many myths about Indigenous peoples persist, such as the idea, that they are a vanishing race, or that their cultures never change. So what are the common myths and misconceptions about Indigenous people?
So I'm only going to share a few.
Yeah, sure.
But some of I will say one is that Indigenous people don't pay taxes. Well, that's completely not true. I'm an Indigenous person. I choose to not live on the reserve. I am considered, by the definition of the Indian Act, status and registered. I do have a tax exemption card, which is defined by the Indian Act, and only those who are registered in status have that exception, right? So Inuit and Métis don't fall within that. Anybody who is 60 scoop and they're not registered are non-status. So they don't have access to the tax exemption rule, right? And so there are many Indigenous people across this nation who have to pay taxes. You live on reserve and you work off reserve, you pay income taxes. So it's just, you have to be aware and educate yourself on some of those misconceptions. Another one is that all Indigenous people have their education and get free housing. Well, that's not true either, and part of the Indian Act is that they are to take care of some medical expenses, provide funding for education. But education is one of those issues that we face as Indigenous people in our communities, that we just have lack of access to education, right? And so when they say they get a free education, that's post-secondary. It's basically an application you submit. You have to be, again, status and registered to apply to your First Nation. And every First Nation has different policies and regulations and rules when it comes down to their education department. So there's stipulations put in place. Tuition might be paid for, but books may not be. Some First Nations might have tuition, books, living allowance available. So it's just a matter of, being aware and educating yourself. You might meet somebody from another First Nation out west, and maybe they have no coverage, right? And so to be mindful of that's a myth and a misconception. In housing, just like everywhere else in Canada, housing is an issue. We're the fastest growing population under the age of 25 in Canada. And so, you're living multiple families in a house, and it's, it can be not healthy, like hygienically healthy for young families or families to live together in large groups. And so, there becomes some inequalities that happen.
There are some other misconceptions. All Indigenous people are the same. What's the reality?
Oh, the reality is we're not. I think I kind of I answered this earlier.
Of course, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we are very distinct across all our nations. And so not to group us together as the same, right? I'm Ojibwe. I have friends who are Cree, right? I have Haudenosaunee friends, right? And who are Iroquois or, and so on. So you can't just assume, right, that we are all the same. And so, and we're not. There's, like I mentioned, I think there was 3,100 reserves based on the Indian Act, right? And so the Haudenosaunee Confederacy wrote their history on a wampum belt, right? And so you have to remember we all didn't do that. So
Another misconception is Indigenous people are unable to adapt to mainstream life.
I'm here. So that's a misconception, right? And I think that falls back to history, right? Trying to eliminate the Indian. And so I think, that's been passed down from generation to generation of non-Indigenous people, that misconception has been shared. I chose to live off reserve. I chose to go to school. Just to let everybody know, it was not allowed. Education was not allowed amongst Indigenous people, right? And so more and more Indigenous people are getting an education because now they're allowed. They have the ability to go get that education, and they're graduating and becoming very successful people.
True. Next is there is another myth about residential schools are history.
No, they're not. They're not. To be honest, it's still a current issue. And until I think society, the nation recognizes that this happened over years, decades, hundreds of years. And so it's not just going to change overnight. It's going to take generations and generations. Senator Murray Sinclair, he even stated the TRC calls to action, the 94 calls to action to the government that, he's not going to see change in his lifetime. His children aren't going to see changes in their lifetime. But he's hopeful his grandchildren's life, they'll start to see change, right? And that just goes to show you it's generation to generation. This occurred over probably 4 or 5 generations, the residential school system. So we have to remember it's going to take at least that long before we start to see change.
Because of all those things, I think September 30 is observed as the National Day of Truth and Reconciliations, also known as Orange Sword Day. So, what is Truth and Reconciliations Day, and why is it significant to the Indigenous community and to entire Canada?
So Orange Shirt Day is also known as TRC Day, which is the national day, which is just recent in the last few years that it's been deemed as a national holiday or stat holiday. But it's not a holiday, a typical holiday to just, go do your shopping or whatever. It's a day of reflection.
Yes.
It's a day for everyone, including Indigenous people, who are learning who they are, right? It's a day of acknowledging, comprehending, learning what the truth of the history of Canada actually is. And then reconciliation can occur. I mean, it doesn't happen that easy, but reconciliation between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people can happen to build relationships of respect. And so Orange Shirt Day originally comes from Phyllis, and you can look onto the Orange Shirt Society webpage about that, and her story is there. But she was taken to a residential school, and she was wearing her favorite orange shirt, and they took it away from her from that day, right? And so, and that's just the gist of what go ahead. I invite people to actually go and learn that story, because it is significant. And that's a big reason why we celebrate those children who have passed on. We acknowledge them. Maybe not celebrate is not the best word to put it, but acknowledgement. But you know what? They survive to the best that they can in those circumstances. So, yeah, celebrate is not the best word, but acknowledgement is.
Absolutely, acknowledgement. Would you like to talk about any events or celebrations in Sudbury and why it is celebrated or observed? Anything coming up? I think I have seen on your Facebook that Cambrian College annual powwow 2025, which is happening on March 22nd. You want to talk about that?
Yes. So sorry, I don't mean to correct you, but it is March 21st and 22nd.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yep. And it's one of the very first powwows that happen here within our community. And it's indoors, but it's open and everyone is welcome to participate. So this is my first year at the Cambrian powwow. I haven't been a part of the Cambrian powwow prior to this because I lived a very different lifestyle. As in hockey, but yeah, we are going to be celebrating, and it's to honor the water walkers. And so water is very important to our Indigenous people, and so it's life. That's where
water is life.
Water is life. And so we are going to be celebrating that. June 21st is Indigenous Peoples Day.
Okay.
And usually there is a powwow that is down at the Bell Park.
Okay.
And everyone is welcome to that. And our two local First Nations, Atikmashing and Wabnode First Nation, both have powwows as well in the summer. But, I definitely would say to get involved within the community of Sudbury first and find out what events are happening. Shkagamik-Kwe has events happening all the time. They have a community, obviously, I was the director of community programs, but they have community programs. And then the Shkagamik Friendship Center also has community programs where they're not just for Indigenous people, right? Anyone can go and access. Do your due diligence, call ahead. But definitely there are various activities and programs and events happening. Support our local artists, right? There's many Indigenous local artists. I don't know them all. However, look them up and show the respect that they deserve and acknowledge who they are.
Almost at the end, and I did talk about the contributions. So, can you highlight some of the significant contributions Indigenous people have made to Canada? Culturally, socially, and economically that are often overlooked?
So we have many artists, and I say artists as a global or umbrella term. We have literaries, we have musicians, we just heard Asanabi, right? And so there are many people who've been making contributions for years. I think I mentioned, Senator Murray Sinclair. He made huge contributions to our people. We have Wabkinu, who was the Premier of Manitoba, right? And so, he's obviously not getting overlooked. However, these are people or artists who have been. And part of that is the colonial way of not acknowledging our Indigenous people, those who are successful. And so what they're doing is being self-determined to just do it. They're making it work. They're making it happen. And for some reason, mainstream society doesn't seem to realize we are one of the fastest growing populations in Canada, and word of mouth gets around. And so, it's happening. The revitalization of Indigenous people is happening. But I will talk about, some of the contributions such as like lacrosse or the toboggan, right? Or chewing gum. If you Google the invention of chewing gum, you're going to get, Google's going to tell you that this dentist made it. Well, realistically, Indigenous people originally discovered chewing gum. They were, sucking on spruce sap. They added sugar, and that's how they created gum.
Wow.
And right, and so it's simple, but people seem to forget that. And so the toboggan comes from our Mi'kmaq people out in Eastern Canada, right? And how they made toboggans were through bark and animal skins, right? And so I think people are starting to recognize that that's where it comes from. And then the lacrosse. I have a very close part to lacrosse. We have a lacrosse association here in Sudbury, and it's open to everybody. It's not just Indigenous people, but it's a great way to learn the original format of lacrosse. It was originally played in plains and fields from anywhere from 100 to 1,000 men. And it was a whole community event that could last for days, right? And so sometimes it was you played lacrosse to dismantle disputes. So those are things, right, that people overlook.
Right. Yeah, everybody knows Indigenous peoples have rich history, diverse cultures, and significant contribution to Canada. However, they have also faced many challenges due to colonizations, discriminations, and government policies. And also, a recent report shows that Indigenous communities continue to face systematic issues such as, higher rates of poverty, health disparities, and unemployment. So, in your view, what are the pressing current issues facing Indigenous community in Canada? What do you want to say?
One thing that hasn't gone away is the discrimination and racism, which, you've outlined the health disparities, the poverty, which are associated with that, right? So what I can say to that is, and this is just not for Indigenous people, everybody is carrying something. Everybody has a story. So before you make any assumption or discrimination towards that person, take a moment, step back, right? And ask yourself, what's their story? What are they carrying? Where do they come from? Right? And so those are the pieces I think that people just don't stop and take a minute, right? And so here in our own community, I can't talk about the education. I've been there long enough, but from a health sector, our Indigenous people are afraid to go to the hospital here because of the discrimination that occurs, and it's on a continuous basis. They would much rather not go to the hospital and seek that emergency care or that care because they don't know how they're going to get treated. And I can say that because as a patient navigator, I've seen a lot, and that's the harsh
It's still the same.
It's still the same. Yeah, I'll give you an example. We had an elder I was advocating for sent me a message saying that they were in the ER and if I can go and advocate on their behalf. So I went in and I was shocked. This elder was hunched over in a wheelchair, wasn't even looked at, wasn't even brought in. Once they were finally brought in, I thought at the time was that she was going to get care. I went and checked in on her the next day. She was put in a closet. She was put in a closet.
Oh my God.
And so that in itself is not okay. I could say another thing, but I'm going to say it's not okay, right? And so that's just one of the discrimination pieces that have occurred and that I've witnessed too, right? And so I think that we just have to take a moment. And it's not just Indigenous people.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff going on right now in our community.
Right.
Take a look. Remember, everybody has a different backpack. Everybody's carrying something else. Everybody has a story.
Everybody has a story. So what changes would you like to see in the policy or societal attitude to support these communities better?
Well, I won't talk from a political standpoint, but
Yeah.
from a societal piece, I will definitely say people just need to educate themselves. They need to become aware. That's that whole piece in the reconciliation part, right? And so they really just need to take time. And even our own Indigenous people, right? They have to be allowed to be given the time to learn who they are, where they come from, and seek out the help. Be ready to seek out the help. We can't make them seek out the help. They have to be ready to do it on their own. But we could also ask for people to be allies, right? Walk with us.
Yeah.
Learn exactly what's going on, and be with us. So, yeah, that's how I would say.
Yeah. In addition to that, what can non-Indigenous Canadians do on a practical level? To support Indigenous communities to promote reconciliation and dispel enduring myths.
I'm going to say it again. They really, take a moment. Learn, acknowledge the truth of what has happened here in Canada, the truth of what happens to your neighbor, right? You have to remember that this didn't happen just overnight. This is decades of trauma that occurred across Canada, not just here, across Canada, right? And the United States. We're not talking about the United States, but a lot of the realities that occurred here in Canada also occurred in the United States. And so I think, practically non-Indigenous people need to not be ignorant, right?
I should not be asking these questions, but before we leave, you have any message to the Canadian government to address Indigenous rights and reconciliation?
Do better. Continue to work at it. Those TRC calls to actions, 94 calls to actions have been put in place. Start doing the work on it, right? And so, and continue to work with Indigenous people. Let them lead the way, because we have to take care of our own people, and we have to take it on to be there. But we also have to remember that we aren't the government either. So, right? We're not right now anyways. And so I'm not much of a political person. However, I will state that, they can do better.
Yeah.
They can do more.
Yeah.
And they can continue to work with Indigenous people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time and this valuable insights.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.